Welcome back to this week's episode of the People Success Circle podcast. My guest today is someone who I know through my business networking. We're both in an organization together, and I could not miss the opportunity to bring her on as a guest. So let me tell you a little bit about her, and then I will welcome her. So Tiffanie Clausewitz is the president of Clausewitz Reyes and a seasoned business attorney with over 15 years experience representing individuals and companies. She is widely respected for guiding clients through complex business disputes, contract negotiations, labor, and employment matters. Deeply committed to advancing women in leadership, Tiffanie is the founding director of the Bexar County Women's Bar Foundation's LEAD program. And she also serves as the founding board chair for Alegria Women's Chorus here in San Antonio. A Texas super lawyer and multiple award recipient, she is recognized not only for her legal expertise, but also for her lasting impact on the San Antonio community. Welcome, Tiffanie. I'm so glad you're here.
Very nice. We should just end now
I know,
to clear off
right? It's like,
expectations.
yeah,
Thank you.
when we hear our bio, I feel the same way sometimes. I'm
Yeah.
like, wow, that's
Okay.
good. But, that's good to hear all the accomplishments you've had. I know you, so I know you have made your mark on San Antonio in
Oh,
so many
thank you.
different ways.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I really love hearing about what you're doing for women lawyers too. So we'll talk about that later in the episode. But
Cool. Yeah.
as
Yeah.
I said, you are a business attorney. And coming from being an HR leader, I have
hmm
worked with business attorneys for years. Back when I worked at McDonald's Corporation, we called them labor legal attorneys on staff because we in
Bet.
HR needed to be able to call them at any point in time if we had an issue. And then as I moved into Gap, we had employer relations and labor legal attorneys. And so it's always been a common person that I've partnered with as an HR leader. So knowing that many people on this call are HR leaders or business professionals who lead and manage others, I just thought this was a great topic. And I'm so glad that you can share your expertise with us.
I'm glad after working with so many attorneys, you want to talk to an attorney. I mean, it's really good. Yeah.
I know
Says a
that's a
lot
good
for the
sign,
attorneys you
right?
worked with. Yeah.
That is a good sign. I actually have really enjoyed working with the attorneys because I I just love having the support for one
Yeah.
thing, right? Like I actually feel like at this point when it comes to employee relations, I'm not a lawyer, but I have worked in enough employee relations situations
hmm
that
hmm
I've learned a lot. But I've just always been grateful for that actual solid advice that we need to
Right.
not only keep the company out of court because we think about that, but also to really protect the employee and make sure we're doing the right thing for the employee.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nobody necessarily wants an attorney to be involved, but they certainly need them. So,
Yes,
yeah,
for sure, for
yeah.
sure. And then now as my own, I own my own business. I've come to you for questions about contracts and things like that because as a business owner, I need your expertise too. So you provide a good service for a variety of different reasons.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So as a business attorney, you see companies at their best and at their worst. What are some of the people related issues that tend to create the biggest legal problems for companies?
There's a couple that come to mind, and one I'll probably sound like a broken record throughout this because I'll probably keep coming back to it because it's that important. The main one that seems to cause issues is failure to communicate clearly and set expectations clearly, have policies and procedures in place
Mm,
and enforce them on a uniform basis.
hmm
There's just so many legal issues that can arise when business owners and leaders don't pay attention to that up front and kind of set the standard from the very beginning and enforce it uniformly. That causes havoc. Another issue that, some legal issues seem to kind of pendulum back and forth, important, hot issues one year or two and then go away the other, but one that does not go away. And I see a lot, especially with smaller businesses,
hmm
is the independent contractors versus employees.
mm,
There's gets a very common issue that comes up with people that employer has hired under an independent contractor agreement because they don't want to hire an employee necessarily yet and have to deal with everything that comes with having someone on as an employee.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
instead, they use an independent contractor agreement, and when done right, and when handled the right way, that's
Mhm.
perfectly. But too
Yeah.
many people just they want an employee, but they just want to hire him under an independent contractor agreement. Or the worker comes and says, "I'd rather be on a 1099 and take all the money home, and I'll deal with my own taxes." Right?
Yes.
And so everybody thinks, "Hey, win-win situation," and it's not,
It's
because
really
that's
not.
where, yeah,
I don't think
yeah,
people really understand that it's not just like our choice. There's a
right.
guideline in the law that guides that decision.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, and so one of the very common things I'll hear is, "Well, Susie sued me for misclassification and said I should have been should have had her as an employee and paid her overtime, but she told me she wanted to be an independent contractor, and the thing is she can't do that." You know what I
Yeah.
mean? You still have to comply with the law. And the thing is hard for people too is it's a multifaceted analysis. It's
Mhm.
a whole variety of factors that are looked at, and there is no clear line. And so
Yeah.
if people have a question, I always tell them, if you're on the line about whether this person should be an employee or an independent contractor, you probably should make them an employee. And those claims are hard for employers, and they're really risky, because even if you litigate it and win, you still lose because you're paying attorney's fees and you're not getting them back. So
Right.
um,
Right.
that's a more narrow issue, but then the whole of what I said earlier about communication and documentation and all of that is big.
First, let's talk about when you said like policies and procedures and guidelines for employees. Are you also meaning like an accurate job description in the beginning, and an employee manual with policies and things like that? Is that what you're referencing?
Yeah, yes, and all of the above, right? We're talking about starting with the job description to, if you have an employment agreement, what does that agreement say?
Mhm.
Texas here, we're an at-will state. You don't have to have a contract because
Yeah.
you can terminate at any time. But that doesn't mean that a lot of people do still have contracts and employment agreements. And just because you can terminate at any time doesn't mean that you can terminate without repercussions, right?
Sure. For
So making sure that you know what you're signing, on both sides. And then we said the job description, it's also policies and procedures. It's an employee handbook if you have one.
Mhm.
And there are, just all of this kind of folds out to provide those guardrails
Yeah.
for your company and for your employees. And it's usually failure to have those in place that makes a case even more difficult when it gets to me. Because if you come to me because you've terminated somebody because they failed to be able to fulfill what you think was an essential job function, and the first thing I'm going to say is, where does it say that?
Yeah.
What did you give them before you hired them, and did you verify, even if it says that, did you verify they could do that before you
Mhm.
hired them? Because those are the questions the TWC is going to be asking me if I'm defending you in a TWC, an employment claim, right?
Yeah.
So that's where it all everything makes a difference.
Everything makes a
Yeah,
difference.
yeah, yeah.
Now I have another question. I told you this was
Yep,
gonna happen. It's like that
go
book,
for it.
Musa Wet Method, and you go on a rampage. So when you say verify that they can actually do that job, is that through having documented interview guides and notes?
That would be one way to do it, absolutely. I mean,
Mhm.
I clearly remember one, and I don't remember the exact details about what the employee couldn't do. And I think it might have been one of the very first TWC claims I handled. And I said, well, hearing officer, they couldn't do XYZ. And they asked me, was it on the job description? And I kind of maneuvered my way into where it was covered under one of the things
Yeah.
on the job description. It wasn't super clear, but it was umbrella. And then they said, and did you verify that they could do this?
Mm.
And the answer was, had anybody ever asked her, could she do it? No. So it's just because it's on the job description. Hey, we hire people all the time, right? That
Mhm.
you put out a qualifications list or requirements, and you think, I'll have this experience, but we can grow them into it.
We can
Right?
make it work.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So, if you are going to, it's just one of the kind of what might be looked at nitpicky things. If you are going to terminate somebody based on something they couldn't do when they told you they did it, hopefully you've got notes or some kind of recording being able to say, yes, we asked, and yes, they said they did. It doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily mean, again, that you have to outside
Yeah.
verify that they could do it, but that they represented they could and then they couldn't. That's gonna
Yes.
be a for cause termination such that you might not be responsible for unemployment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my HR consulting firm, I do employee manuals for companies,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I'm currently working with a company that has locations in 5 different states, but they have one employee manual, which sounds great because they have an employee manual, but it doesn't talk
Yeah.
about the individual state
Right.
regulations
Right.
and laws,
Right.
and so that's what we're working on with them to update it and make it relevant. And so I often think just because you have a manual doesn't mean it's working the way that it should. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of people think, and you'll know this working HR consulting, but they think I'll go find a template handbook online and download and copy it, and there's my manual. Well, I guess theoretically that's better than nothing.
Yes.
Theoretically,
Yes.
most of the time, it's better than nothing, but not always because, as you said, each states have different requirements, and so was it drafted in the state that you were in, and so is it jurisdictionally accurate?
Mm,
Or if you've got, like you mentioned, having employees in different states, well, then you can have one basic handbook that has all of the general provisions and then all of the policies and procedures that are driven by federal law, right? But if you're in some states that tend to have more stringent or
yes.
active state and even local sometimes regulations, you need to make sure that you've got an addendum or an addition appendix, whatever you want to call it, that is addressing that specific state.
Yeah, for sure. Even like I said, even down to the county. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
and not all counties have it. And certainly in Texas, it's, I would say, less stringent than
Yeah.
a lot of other places. However, I have listeners all over the world, really. And so
Right.
I think it's just important to know wherever you are to verify your
Exactly.
local, down to the county and state policies that affect your business. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the classification. So
Mhm.
you mentioned 1099 to employee. Another thing I also see is like employers will just decide someone's exempt,
Mhm.
versus non-exempt, and they
Yeah.
really don't know that there's a law that determines if you are exempt or
Absolutely.
non-exempt. It's not
Right.
just if you want the person to be exempt or
Exactly.
non-exempt.
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you see
Yeah.
that too?
All the time, all the time. And because again, it's just it's a more complicated analysis. Even people that are aware of it don't realize, again, it's just so many factors and exceptions and exemptions and all of that. So it's not something that generally a layperson is going to know. It's not something as an attorney that I can rattle off the top of my head. I'm going to
No,
have
me
to look it
neither.
up.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, as many of these cases as I've done, I can't rattle it off to you because it's complicated. And so
Mhm.
there's this um there's this desire to just classify everybody as exempt and pay them a salary because I mean, let's be real, for budgeting purposes for a business owner, that's certainly much more predictable, right? We
Yes.
know that
Yeah.
no matter how many hours this person works, we're going to pay this flat amount, and most of the
Mhm.
time that's not working. They're going to have to be paid overtime. And so then I'll have clients come in and say, well, I mean, I paid him a salary, but it was an exorbitant salary. And so
Yeah.
even if you do the calculation at the minimum wage, I would have already paid him overtime. And very unfortunately for them, that's not how it works, right? You
That's not
take the
how it works.
salary and you
Yeah.
calculate what that would be as a flat rate, no matter if
Yeah.
they were paid a fantastic salary and you're paying up and above. So yeah, I mean, those are just some of the issues that, even for small businesses who are thinking, gosh, I really don't want to be upfronting money to an attorney. It's a good idea. There are just some fundamental decisions that should be run by an attorney at the beginning because it's going to help you avoid disputes and exposure and legal fees and costs later.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have learned that personally. So I know as a founder, at many times when we start a business, we really think about, building our offers, getting our clients, revenue, growth, and then guilty as
Mhm,
charged here too. We think
mhm.
about investing in contracts or, like we said,
Right.
handbooks or proper training around things that could be legal pitfalls. So when you see somebody like that, and like I said, I'm guilty of that as well. What things do you just really wish that a business owner knew right from the get go? Like, I know
Yeah.
you're focusing on your offers, but you must do XYZ.
Right. So, I mean, the very first decision you make is what type of entity you're going to form, right? And so, in Texas, look, like 90% of entities that are being, and that's not an exact percentage, it varies, but about 90% of entities, 85% are LLCs because we have
Mhm.
the advantage of that structure. That's a very nice, flexible structure that can be still be taxed like it's passed through as like a partnership, but it has some of the protections of a corporation. But those decisions matter for reasons related to taxation, which is
Mhm.
always when I say before you make that decision, talk to your accountant. I'm not
Yeah.
an accountant, but also from the liability exposure and the authority of those that have ownership interests, right? So that's
Mhm.
super important, I would say, to chat with an attorney about that decision. When you form the entity for, say, an LLC, there's an operating agreement that needs to be put in place or a company agreement, depending on how it's phrased. It's all the same thing. If you're a solo entrepreneur, that agreement doesn't matter so much because you're
Mhm.
working with yourself and that's it. But
Yeah.
if you have a partner or another member, another owner, or what have you, whether they are your equal or you've got minority, majority, whether you consider them silent or not, if you don't put an operating agreement into place and make those decisions about
Mhm.
authority, about rights, and how things are going to be managed and decisions made, then you are leaving yourself to the mercy of the Business Organizations Code, which
Yeah.
isn't terrible. It's probably just not what you expect.
Yeah.
Right. And
Exactly.
so, yeah, so for business owners that have partners, I really wish they would invest up front in that operating agreement. We deal with lots of business owners who come to us and they're fighting. We call it like a business divorce or whatever.
Yes.
One owner is like, I'm done, I want out, but there is no mechanism to just get out of a company under the
Yeah.
code, right? You
Yeah.
own it, you have a responsibility for it, you have to maintain it. Those company agreements are critical in setting the guidelines, the guardrails up front about what's going to
Mhm.
happen in certain situations.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
when
That makes
people are
sense.
starting a business, they're super excited with like, "Oh, my best friend and I are starting a business." And I always cringe a little bit because, oh, there's so much that could go wrong. You know what I
Yes.
mean? And
Yes.
it's your best
Our
friend.
family.
Yeah, or family, exactly. So, but great. While y'all are still getting along fabulously, let's talk about how, you would want to deal with these issues
Yeah.
that come up.
Yeah, for
Let's talk
sure.
about especially if you're 50-50, which is a terrible idea, but whatever. Yeah. So those agreements are just really crucial.
So now let's switch to like a corporation. Let a company where, maybe the listener is like, I don't own a company, but I lead people in my company.
Mhm.
What advice do you have for leaders to help them mitigate or, stay away from employment disputes in the team that they have? How can a leader just prevent employment issues
Yeah.
and disputes?
Well, it's really all about the culture that the company has created from the top down. And I guess what I'm probably overthinking this because that's what we do. What authority do they have as far as creation and enforcement of policies and procedures?
Hmm.
One of the biggest issues that I see come up is kind of lack of clarity leads to misunderstanding and issues that then can expose a company to risk. And so that's why it's so important that the policies and procedures clearly lay out expectations. They clearly lay out complaint processes. Those are huge, and reporting processes so that employees feel empowered and unintimidated in reporting issues and talking to their supervisors without fear of reprisal and keeping those communication lines super, super open. But
Mhm.
also with that is with those communication lines open, then the leader has to be empowered and consistently enforce the policies and
Yeah.
procedures that are in place. So
Mhm.
I feel like up front is clarity and good communication with employees. And then as issues arise, it's consistent enforcement, right, of those policies and
Yes.
procedures
Yes.
that's going to protect you.
I see the lack of consistent enforcement more than
Hmm.
anything from an
Right,
HR perspective.
right. Absolutely.
Similar to you, someone will come to me in HR and they'll say, so and so is not working out and it's time to terminate them. And my first question is like, will they be surprised? Do they know anything
Exactly.
about this coming? Tell me more
Right,
information. Really just unpacking what's the story that led to where we
right,
are now. It's not as
right,
simple as I want to terminate this person or I'm going to terminate this person. It's like there's a story that led you to this point and we need
right,
to unpack it and really just make sure that, I always say in HR, my goal is to certainly protect the company and keep them out of court, but also to represent every employee and making sure that they're getting
right.
fair treatment
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that, is first and foremost the most important thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we find so often that when there is a not for a nefarious reason, but when there's a lack of communication, if you're not talking to the employees, they're talking to others or they're telling themselves a
Mhm.
story. And so if they don't understand why something is happening, they will have a whole narrative built up and be ready to
Yeah.
run with it. And
Yeah.
so it's kind of like you said, I think a lot of people think that they are kind of, what's the word? They are being kind to
Yeah.
employees by not being clear about expectations and not jumping in early when issues are identified and course correcting quickly. They think like first it's, oh, it'll get better. And then it's
Mhm.
like, gosh, I don't want to deal with this until
Yeah.
you're at a termination standpoint and you get to termination and that, employee who's maybe, what we call protected status under Title VII, they've noticed the pulling back and the freezing out, and they feel like
Yeah.
they are being treated differently. And so you
Mhm.
terminate them and say it's for cause, and they've decided it's for another reason. And it
Yeah.
just leads you to all the time that you have to spend defending the company and your actions.
Yeah. I did a podcast episode with my guest was Cindy Rowe, and she talks
Hmm.
about kindness. And
Hmm.
that is the main topic that Cindy is known for.
Yeah.
And she talked a lot about how kindness is not ignoring performance issues.
Right.
There's
Right.
nothing kind about talking about someone not performing and not letting them know. You know?
Absolutely.
Like, the kind thing is
Absolutely.
actually to, do the right thing, which is the hard thing oftentimes,
Hmm.
but to really involve the employee and make sure that they know. The other thing I see sometimes in HR is, not even that the leader wants to come in and is ready to term them. They've kind of figured out a way to work around all of it. They're like, "Well, I could lay that person off, or I could move
Yeah.
them to another team." Oh my gosh, that one happens a lot, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because they just don't want to handle those difficult conversations and document those difficult conversations. So, those things can happen. And I think, for all the leaders out there, the best thing you can do is to do the kind thing, which is to address performance, document it, and partner with human resources so that you're doing things in the right way.
Exactly. And it's like you said, nobody should be surprised when those disciplinary actions come. Nobody should be surprised.
Yeah, no, they really
Yeah.
shouldn't. So you mentioned culture. So how should companies think about culture from a legal perspective?
I mean, I think that you kind of have to think of culture as the internal controls, kind of like in accounting, right? Because
Mm,
what you're doing is you're trying to prevent losses, victimable
mhm,
losses. So, and we just talked about this, right? I mean, most legal problems aren't surprises; they're patterns. They are
oh, yeah.
an employee that keeps manager or supervisor usually, right, who keeps crossing lines that everybody
Mhm,
just kind of says that's no big deal, or it's a team that cuts corners or somebody who's given special treatment maybe because they're a high performer so they get a loose line on other requirements and what have you. So this is all noticeable. It's not
mhm,
surprising, but those are the patterns that if they are allowed to persist, they create the opening for lawsuits, for investigations, and for turnover because employees
mhm.
don't like working in those situations, right?
Right, right.
And so culture is absolutely, it's a risk factor because it's a leading indicator that tells you what claims you're going to face later. And so, in that respect, I feel like the best legal strategy is aligning your culture with clear expectations, with consistent enforcement, and a safe reporting process. I mentioned that a little bit just a second, but probably not enough. It's just critical that employees feel safe making complaints, making reports so that you know what's going on because you can't
Yes.
address it if you don't know. And
Right.
so, too many times people will say that, well, I didn't know how to report, it wasn't in the handbook. And the employer's coming
Mm.
to me and saying, all they had to do was tell me. And I said,
Yes.
well, but you didn't tell them that's all they
Yes.
had to do. And then
Right.
another part of that, from a legal perspective, going a little bit off of a rabbit hole, is when somebody reports, makes a complaint under like Title VII, reporting is a protected action, right? And
Mhm.
so if you suffer an adverse employment action after you have participated in that protected action, or you're looking at a retaliation claim. Well, again, some people are like, well, they didn't report it. Well, they told a supervisor, but that supervisor didn't think it was a big deal and didn't pass it up the chain. That's a
Yes.
report. Under the statute, that's a report. And so then, even when that employee is fired or demoted or whatever later, even though maybe the person up higher that actually made that decision didn't know about the report, it's happened.
Yeah.
So
And they
it's
represent
just,
the company.
yeah, yeah. So just a clear reporting structure is crucial, again, that culture for employees to know that they have avenues for being heard
Mhm.
is really important, and a culture of knowing that the expectations are clear and I'm expected to follow them.
Mhm. Do you recommend sometimes I see it in jobs descriptions, and this is an honest question for me. Do you recommend that the job description say the reporting structure too? Some do and some don't. And I've never really like enforced it. And then a lot of companies don't have org charts. So when you
Yeah,
say to have a clear reporting structure, I know you mean to report an issue, but if there's not a clear reporting structure of like, do I go to the owner? Do I go to the department manager? Like, who do I report to? And then
right.
who do I go to after that? How do you recommend they clarify?
Usually those are going to be in either a policy and procedure or in the handbook, depending on if you have a
Mhm.
handbook or not, right?
Okay.
But that's one of the, like from the very beginning up front, even if you don't have a full handbook, there's a handful of policies that you absolutely should have new employees sign off on. And that's one of
Mhm.
them. And it's
Yeah.
going to be an explicit direction. If you have, I mean, it can be as simple as you report to HR, but even
Yes.
better if you can put who they report to in HR, and it can be a
Mhm.
position, not a person, in case that's going to
Yes.
change. Right. And you always need to have, there are smaller companies that don't have an HR department, right? Their
Yeah.
CEO or their
Tons. Yeah.
supervisor, somebody's handling it. So you also want to have an alternative reporting person because, I mean,
Mhm.
frankly, they might be complaining about the person they're supposed to report to. And
Yeah.
so, if you're saying
Yeah.
report up to your supervisor, well, what if the supervisor is the one they're complaining about? So there needs to be a backup. Like if you can't report to that person because they're the one you're complaining about, then
Yeah.
second choice is this. But
Yeah.
yeah, it needs to be written down. I mean, it needs to be something that they have signed and acknowledged because then if they don't do that, that is one of the defenses the company has is to be able to say, hi, employees signed this. This was the reporting structure and they didn't do that. So we didn't know. There was
Right.
nothing we could do about it because we didn't know.
Right. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes perfect sense. And I do recommend having 2 people there
Yeah.
just in case. And then I think there's also, leaders are really perceived often as having favoritism, right? And so
Absolutely.
somebody will say, "Well, it's my boss I'm unhappy with, but I can't go to their boss because I can tell they're really good friends," right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever, and there's that perceived favoritism that happens. And so I really love that you just said regardless of the size of your company, you should have that policy.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that makes perfect sense. Let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about the support that you provide women lawyers. And I would love to hear a little bit about what prompted you to found the program called LEAD that you have here in San Antonio.
Oh, absolutely. So it was kind of a confluence of a few things that happened. At the time we founded this program, I was the president of the Women's Bar here in Bexar
Hmm.
County. And we were kind of trying to come up with our next big thing, which the Women's Bar in San Antonio has a deep history of creating projects that benefit the community. And so
Mhm.
it was time for a new one. And I was doing some strategic planning with a committee to figure out what was next. About the same time, two things. One was I was personally looking for some leadership development, a leadership development program. I felt like I needed to enhance my skills, and I
Mhm.
couldn't really find anything local that was applicable or that I was interested in. And so I just kind of had a thirst for something. And
Mhm.
then the other factor was at the time, the National Association of Women Lawyers had just put out their decade long study of the attrition of women in the legal field. And so
Mm.
they've been working hard over 10 years to pull the numbers up for representation of women in the field, and really no headway had been made at all.
Mm.
So those three things together, it was leadership development, the women's bar, conveniently, we needed a new project, and then the attrition of women. What can we do to convince women don't leave, right? When you hit a barrier, don't quit, find a way to go around it. And so
Yeah.
that's what led to the
Yeah.
program, right? Is it's we're aimed at helping with attrition. I'm happy. I was happy to see we had our ninth class just kicked off, and so I was giving updated stats
So
over the
great.
last 10 years. Yeah, and in the 10 years that the program's been going, the pipeline numbers are going strong. When you look at women in law school, they outnumber a little bit men in law school. When you look at
Mm.
entering the field as an associate level, we're neck and neck.
Mm.
Where the numbers start dropping is in promotion up, right? It's promotion up to partner level, up to equity owner, and to decision maker
Mhm.
roles. And so there's still a ways to go. Numbers have gotten better, but there's
Yes.
certainly not anywhere. There's no parity, of course. We've got to figure out what's going on and what can we do to help improve improve that situation. And so I feel like we've made a lot of headway here in Bear County. We actually have a cool program. The next seminar for the class has a panel discussion called Good Guys. And
Mm.
so we've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, and we bring in men who are allies for the promotion of women in the industry. And we have a panel presentation, and then each class member brings a guy that's a good guy in their life who's an ally. And we have a really frank and kind of open discussion. And it's just always interesting to hear the feedback from the men in the room who they've never thought about these issues or the consequences of them because they've never had to. And so being put in the situation, it's always a little uncomfortable at the beginning, but by the end, it's just really fantastic. And I feel like the more of those conversations we can have with the men, and the more that we can help women to realize you can practice however you want to practice law. There isn't the cookie cutter image of a woman attorney on Law and Order or something like that, right?
Yeah.
That's not it. That's not real.
Not it.
And
Yeah.
sometimes women are quitting because they have kind of worked themselves into a box of very strict requirements that they feel like they can't meet
Mhm.
because they've been telling themselves a story of what it means to be successful. And so we
Mm.
try to open up the lens of no, success is when you're happy doing what you're doing. That's it.
Yeah.
That's really all
Yeah.
it comes to. You're practicing authentically as yourself, and you're happy. And so that's what we work on. And we've
Yeah.
got almost 150 alums now. So it's really cool.
That is so amazing. That is so amazing, and it's cohort based, right? So every year you have a new cohort.
We do of about 16. Yeah. Yeah. So it's really
Okay.
great. The relationship building has been incredible.
Yeah. Well, I hope you're super proud of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love it.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I know that I learned a lot, and I'm sure that my audience members did too. So I just want to thank you for your time. I know you are extremely busy and just appreciate you sharing with us.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the People Success Circle podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend or leave a review. You can find contact information for Tiffanie at Clausewitz Reyes Law Firm, as well as we will put a link to the Bear County Lead Academy so that you can learn more about that as well. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.